Okay, team, tonight we're learning about the Reformation. Okay, before we start looking at the Reformation, I'd like to introduce you to the concept of the perfect storm. Not the George Clooney movie that you see at the picture below, but the concept where when many bad things happen at the same time, the result is disaster. Now, to achieve the Reformation, the perfect storm for the Christian church really came in three parts. The first is the influence of the Renaissance. The second was corruption within the church. And the last was a series of church reformers. Now, if you think to the Renaissance, you have a lot of people who are saying that they can do things on their own. Remember, this is called humanism. And so artists like to say that they were capable of doing anything that they wanted. And as a result, the Reformation will have this type of influence as well. The biggest example of this is Christian humanism. And this really started to take place not in Italy, but in Northern Europe, where people like Erasmus started to write about how important it was to read the Bible and to read ancient Christian texts and to interpret these texts on your own. They didn't believe in going to church and listening to priests tell you what the Bible says, nor listening to priests tell you what the Bible means. So they favored interpreting the Bible into languages that people could read, and then going to read the Bible and then make one's own conclusion. The second part of the church's perfect storm comes from within the church itself. Priests and bishops and even popes were guilty of many things, as they were the sole source of power during the Middle Ages. And one of the things that a lot of priests and bishops and popes had were families. They were married and they had children. In addition to this, many priests and bishops and popes took advantage of political power. When you think back to feudalism, there are lords and vassals. A lot of cases, religious figures like priests and bishops were actually given large tracts of land, and they had peasants working for them within the feudal pyramid. So literally, they are serving two bosses. They're serving their religious boss, and they're serving their political boss. So they're getting rich and powerful at the same time as doing their religious duties. The result of this is that many priests and bishops and popes got very, very rich. And as you know, a lot of times they would spend the money on themselves. They would throw fancy parties. They would buy really expensive clothes and nice things for their houses. They would build nice castles and palaces. And so they're using the people's money very, very selfishly. And the last example of corruption comes from how the church raised money. And this is by selling indulgences. An indulgence is simply a certificate that a priest would sell to a person, and this would allow the person's dead relative or relatives to spend less time in purgatory and to reach heaven faster. Now, there are many problems with this. The first, you don't know if it's actually working, but even worse during this time, the priest who was selling you the certificate was most likely keeping the money for himself. He didn't turn it over to the Pope. This wasn't used to build new churches or to help the people. Instead, the priest got very rich off of these certificates that they were selling to people. A second way that priests and bishops got rich was they started awarding people jobs based upon how much money the people could pay them to be employed. So basically, they were selling church offices to the highest bidder, not to the most qualified people. This is called simony. So all of these examples of corruption made some church reformers very, very mad. Now, remember, the word here is reform, not destroy. Reform means to change. These reformers want to change the church, not destroy it. And you have two examples in front of you. One is a guy called John Wycliffe from England. The other is a guy called Jan Hus, which would today, he would live in the Czech Republic. At the time, it was part of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, these two men were contemporaries. They lived at the same time in the late 1300s and early 1400s. What they wanted was some very basic changes. Wycliffe wanted the Bible to be translated into English so that common Englishmen and Englishwomen could read the Bible on their own, just like Erasmus said. Hus wanted to go even further, and he wanted the church to stop selling indulgences. Now, as you can imagine, these two men were very unpopular by the church for these beliefs. Wycliffe was lucky enough to die before the church punished him, but even after his death, the church dug up his bones and burned them. Jan Hus was put to death by the church for his beliefs. He was given a chance to recant, meaning take his beliefs back, but he refused to do so, and he was burned at the stake. This is a medieval drawing of Jan Hus being burned at the stake for his beliefs. Now, these two guys gave way to the most famous of reformers, Martin Luther. Smile, Martin. Luther is German. He's a university professor. He's also a monk. He lives in a small town called Wittenberg. The W sounds like a V. Now, Luther's ideas are not new. He protested the selling of indulgences. He wanted the Bible to be translated into German so that common Germans could read the Bible for themselves. The biggest difference is how he protested these acts of corruption. So as you can see, he protested this by writing a document called the 95 Theses, and he nailed this document in a public place. It was at the church in Wittenberg. But soon, people were copying it, and it was reprinted using the new printing press. So literally all over Germany, and then later all over Europe, you have Martin Luther's words being spread. The biggest difference between Luther and Wycliffe and Hus was that he believed that faith alone should get you into heaven. Now, the Christian church said that faith, as well as good deeds and obedience to the church, would allow you to get into heaven. Luther believed that it's all about faith. Now, questions. I want you to answer these questions in your notes because I will ask them when you come to class tomorrow. Luther was more successful than Wycliffe and Hus. Why? Why do you think Luther survived this period? He was not burned at the stake, and his bones were not dug up and burned by the church. How are Luther's actions good for Europe? And also, how were they bad for Europe? And lastly, if you were the Pope and Luther was making all of this noise, what do you do? How would you respond? That's it. Have a good night.